It all started when my friend Jake and I were on a road trip through Colorado in search of scenic mountain views. We had a loose plan, some snacks, and an old playlist blasting through the speakers. The day had been bright, clear, and full of promise. It was at a gas station in a small town that a local suggested we try the Old Pass, a lesser-known route that supposedly offered breathtaking views. "It's not on most maps," he said, his grin revealing a missing tooth. "But if you want an adventure, that's the way to go." Jake's eyes lit up, and I could tell he was sold. Adventure was his middle name. Against my better judgment, I agreed. After all, it wasn't on the map, and maybe that's what made it sound so tempting. The road wound higher and higher into the mountains, and soon the air grew colder. The sunshine that had warmed us earlier was slowly replaced by a chilling breeze. The trees thickened, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the narrow road, even in the daylight. I glanced at Jake, who was gripping the wheel with a bit more determination. "Still feeling adventurous?" I joked, trying to lighten the tension that had begun to creep in. But Jake just grinned. The road became steeper and more winding, the turns sharp and relentless, hugging the edges of cliffs that dropped away into an abyss of pine trees and jagged rocks. The higher we climbed, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. The air had a sharpness to it, biting at our skin through the rolled-down windows. The sunlight barely broke through the canopy above, and soon we were swallowed by an unrelenting tunnel of trees. The feeling of isolation grew more profound with each passing mile. Jake, ever the optimist, seemed undeterred, but I could feel a creeping sense of unease settling in my chest. The road eventually brought us to an abandoned ranger station, a small wooden structure almost swallowed by the overgrowth around it. The paint was peeling, the windows shattered, and nature seemed to have reclaimed what was once a functioning outpost. "Let's check it out," Jake said, already opening his door before I could protest. I followed reluctantly, my steps crunching on the gravel path leading up to the door. Inside, we found nothing but dust, broken furniture, and an old yellowed map pinned to the wall. The word danger had been scribbled across the pass we were on, written in a shaky hand, the ink smeared and faded. I pointed it out, but Jake just scoffed. "Probably some kid's idea of a joke," he said, waving it off. Still, a shiver ran down my spine, a whisper of a warning I couldn't quite ignore. Not long after we left the ranger station, a thick fog rolled in, almost as if the mountains themselves were trying to swallow us. It began as a thin mist, drifting lazily across the road, but soon it thickened, pressing in on all sides, obscuring our view entirely. The fog was so dense that the headlights seemed to bounce back off of it, illuminating nothing but a wall of white. Jake slowed the car, his eyes squinting as he tried to peer through the murky haze. The road seemed to disappear ahead of us, and I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. That's when we started hearing the noises, strange, unsettling sounds coming from outside, twigs snapping, low growls, and, most unnervingly, faint whispers that seemed to be carried on the wind. I turned to Jake, my voice tight. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face unusually serious. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I heard it." His bravado was beginning to fade, and the silence that settled in the car was thick with unspoken fear. The whispers continued, just beyond the edge of our perception, like they were playing with us, taunting us. I could feel my pulse racing, my eyes darting around in the hope of catching a glimpse of whatever was out there. As we continued, we spotted what looked like another car's taillights in the distance, a dim red glow flickering through the fog. Relief washed over me. Maybe we weren't alone out here after all. I could almost imagine another couple of travelers, just as lost as we were, but at least it would mean we weren't isolated. We drove closer, but when we reached it, the sight chilled me to the bone. It wasn't another car driving along the pass. It was a wreck, its metal frame twisted, the doors flung open, their contents scattered as if someone, or something, had torn through it in a hurry. The taillights were broken, reflecting the light from our own car. Jake let out a low whistle, his bravado finally starting to crack. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The scene was unsettling. The car looked like it had been there for years, rusted and covered in grime, yet the taillights had been glowing, hadn't they? My mind struggled to reconcile what I was seeing with what I had expected. The wind picked up, and I could hear it whispering through the shattered windows of the car, almost as if it were telling us to leave. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Jake didn't argue this time. He just nodded and put the car back in gear. The road grew narrower still, the gravel giving way to uneven rocks that made every movement a struggle. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches scratching against the windows like skeletal fingers trying to grab hold of us. The noise was grating, almost like nails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge. Then, without warning, rocks began to fall from the cliffs above, clattering onto the road in front of us. Jake cursed, slamming the brakes, and we both watched, helpless, as the path ahead became blocked by a pile of boulders. There was no way we could drive through. "Guess we're moving them ourselves," Jake muttered, trying to mask the unease in his voice. We climbed out, the cold mountain air biting at my face, the chill seeping through my jacket. The fog was thicker now, swirling around us, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. As we worked to move the smaller rocks, I noticed something in the mud near the wrecked car. Footprints, barefoot, deep, and leading away from the wreck into the dense fog. My mouth went dry. "Jake," I called, pointing them out. He looked over, his brow furrowing. "Who the hell walks barefoot out here?" He tried to laugh, but it sounded forced, hollow. The footprints were large, and they seemed recent, the edges of the impression still sharp in the wet earth. Suddenly, there was a sound, a whisper, but louder this time, coming from somewhere behind us. I spun around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but fog and shadows. The temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold biting into my skin, chilling me to the bone. Jake dropped the rock he was holding. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice unsteady. We rushed back to the car, our breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps, the fog seeming to thicken with every passing second. We climbed in, and Jake started the engine. But as we began to drive, it became horrifyingly clear that the road behind us had disappeared. Where there had once been a narrow path, there was now only dense forest, the trees thick and unyielding, as if they had grown there in an instant. The ranger station we had passed was nowhere to be seen. Panic settled in, a suffocating weight on my chest. Jake's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of a way out. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. We drove in what felt like circles, the fog disorienting, every turn leading us deeper into an unfamiliar and increasingly hostile landscape. The whispers never stopped, always just at the edge of hearing, taunting us, leading us further into the unknown. The fog seemed alive, shifting and swirling, obscuring our view, making it impossible to tell where we were or where we were going. The hours blurred together, each one more disorienting than the last. The fog twisted the landscape into something unrecognizable, the road narrowing until it was little more than a trail. The trees pressed in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky entirely. We were trapped in a tunnel of darkness, the only light coming from our increasingly dim headlights. Jake's face was set in grim determination, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that we were lost in a place that shouldn't exist. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell us something we couldn't understand. By the time we were rescued, days later, though it felt like a lifetime, we were delirious, dehydrated, and utterly terrified. The search team found us wandering along a different road entirely, far from where we had started. They didn't believe our story. No one did. The route we described didn't exist on any map, and the ranger station we spoke of had apparently been torn down years ago. Jake and I tried to convince ourselves it had been some sort of shared delusion, a trick of exhaustion and fear. Story 2. I was en route to my cousin's engagement celebration, running behind schedule, as the GPS persistently rerouted me to circumvent an accident on the main highway. The proposed alternative seemed straightforward, just a series of back roads and a turnoff near a small town. I proceeded without much contemplation until the familiar streetlights disappeared, replaced by a gravel surface that signaled a more primitive route. The gravel road quickly devolved into a narrow, uneven pathway, evoking a growing sense of isolation. The previously clear navigation on my phone became unreliable, as if the device itself questioned the legitimacy of my course. There were no indications of other travelers or any human establishments. It was merely me and this solitary road, my headlights piercing through the enveloping darkness. The fuel gauge descended perilously close to empty, the orange light flickering a persistent reminder of my dwindling reserves. I exhaled heavily, my grip on the steering wheel tightening, tension subtly spreading across my fingers. After what felt like an interminable stretch of time, I came upon an old wooden bridge, its timbers visibly weathered, emitting creaks that sounded almost like groans of distress. It spanned a shallow ravine, and as I cautiously edged my car forward, the boards protested under the vehicle's weight. Halfway across, the structure sagged ominously, causing me to hold my breath as the car proceeded, every sound amplified by the silence around me. The tension eased only when I finally reached the other side, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but my nerves were frayed, every instinct signaling that something about this detour was fundamentally amiss. On the other side, the road diverged with no markers or indicators to clarify the direction. Left or right, both options appeared equally foreboding, dark, desolate, and silently threatening. I chose the left, trusting that instinct might be my only guide. As I continued, my headlights illuminated something deeply unsettling. Tire tracks leading off into a ditch where abandoned vehicles lay rusting. The metal of the cars was corroded and tangled among overgrown brush, the scene one of stark abandonment. My heart pounded in my chest, a visceral reaction to the unspoken narrative of this place. Why were there so many vehicles here, discarded and forgotten? I attempted to suppress the growing unease, but the phone's signal had vanished, and dusk surrendered to night far quicker than anticipated, enveloping the landscape in darkness. The headlights, despite their brightness, seemed inadequate against the encroaching gloom, swallowed by the oppressive wall of trees that flanked the narrow road. The branches, twisted and gnarled, appeared almost sentient, reaching out as if they sought to ensnare me. Strange carvings began to emerge on the bark, symbols, crude and enigmatic, evoking something ancient and malevolent. A chill raced down my spine, and I could not shake the overwhelming urge to turn back, but the road was too narrow to permit such a maneuver. I decelerated as my headlights caught sight of something up ahead, a figure standing resolutely in the middle of the road, a silhouette, unmoving, rigid in the dim light. I honked the horn, the sound slicing through the stillness, but the figure remained unperturbed, as though indifferent to my presence. I flicked my headlights, hoping to provoke some response, but they stood there, statuesque, as if waiting for something. My pulse quickened. The situation felt wrong in a way that defied simple explanation. I couldn't discern their features, but their posture, unnatural, rigid, conveyed an eerie deliberateness, one that seemed devoid of human warmth. I nudged the car forward cautiously, my hands clammy against the steering wheel. As I drew near, just close enough to discern more detail, the figure turned deliberately and moved towards the woods, vanishing into the shadows of the trees with a slow, almost ethereal gait. A nauseating twist gripped my stomach. The clothes they wore appeared antiquated, decades out of place, tattered, faded, and unfamiliar. Their face, even in the limited light, struck me as pallid, devoid of emotion, almost as if it lacked any human quality altogether. I hesitated, every instinct urging me to leave immediately, to distance myself from this inexplicable encounter. With my heart pounding, I pressed the gas pedal, propelling the car away from the spot, the engine roaring in response. The road twisted and wound ahead, but a sinking realization settled in as I began to recognize familiar markers. The same gnarled tree, the same derelict car rusting in the ditch. My hands began to tremble. It felt as though I was being ensnared in some malevolent loop. Each turn brought me back to where I had been before, an endless cycle of disorientation. Panic started to constrict my thoughts. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my knuckles blanching under the strain. I needed clarity, needed to maintain control. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. But those carvings, those mocking symbols etched into the bark, seemed to elude comprehension, heightening my sense of dread. The idea began to solidify that perhaps this route was not on any map, that perhaps I had inadvertently driven into a realm that should not be discovered. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the road began to widen, and the GPS screen flickered back to life, nonchalantly rerouting me back to the main highway, as though the events of the past hours had been inconsequential. I released a shaky breath, feeling the tension in my chest ease slightly. I merged onto the highway, the illumination from passing vehicles a comforting contrast to the unnerving darkness I had left behind. Yet, as I glanced into the rearview mirror, I noticed the scratches adorning my car. Deep, irregular gouges, as though something had clawed at the metal, leaving a mark I could not explain. A weight dropped in my stomach. These scratches, these inexplicable signs, were remnants of a detour that I wished fervently I had never taken. When I finally arrived at my cousin's engagement party, I chose a spot at the far end of the lot, distancing my battered vehicle from the others. My hands still trembled as I emerged from the car, the chill night air doing little to steady my rattled nerves. I glanced back at my car under the dim streetlights, the dents and scratches less visible but no less real. I knew that recounting this experience would only invite disbelief. My story would sound like the fabrications of a poor horror movie plot. Inside the venue, the warmth of laughter and music contrasted jarringly with the lingering terror. My family greeted me with cheer, their faces lit with joy, utterly unaware of the ordeal from which I had just emerged. I forced a smile, attempting to blend in, but my thoughts kept drifting back, replaying the sight of that solitary figure in the darkness, the strange symbols etched into the trees that seemed to pulse with something vile. I knew that I would never forget the suffocating sensation of entrapment, the feeling of being ensnared on a road that looped without end, determined to hold me captive. And even now, when the world falls silent and I am alone in the depths of night, I swear I can still hear it, the groaning timbers of that ancient bridge, the whispers threading through the trees, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of someone, or something, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting. Story 3. A buddy of mine, Ryan, convinced me to join him for a weekend hike in the Smoky Mountains. He had this grand idea of taking a little-known trail he'd read about online, supposedly a beautiful, secluded path that led to a hidden lake. It was only supposed to take a few hours, and he promised we'd be back by sunset. At first I hesitated, but Ryan's enthusiasm was infectious, and before I knew it, we were packed up and ready to go. The trail started off fine. It was narrow but well-trodden, with signs marking the way every so often. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed alive, full of the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. We joked around, taking pictures and enjoying the sights. But as we progressed, the trail began to grow more overgrown, the underbrush thickening around us. Ryan kept saying we were on track, but the trail markers became harder to spot. The bright orange paint was faded, almost blending in with the bark, and soon we found ourselves stopping more frequently to make sure we were still headed the right way. Eventually, we reached a clearing where the trail split into two. There were no signs this time, just two paths winding in different directions. Ryan insisted we go right. He said he felt sure that was the way to the lake. I wasn't so convinced. Something about the clearing made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The silence felt heavy, the kind of quiet that didn't belong in a forest. We argued for a moment, my gut telling me to turn back, but Ryan's confidence won out. We compromised by marking the spot with a pile of stones, just in case we had to find our way back. Hours passed, and the terrain grew steeper, more challenging. The trail, if it could still be called that, was barely visible, and we had to navigate through thick patches of thorny bushes that tore at our clothes. We stumbled upon strange items along the way: an old hiking boot, half buried in the dirt, a rusted canteen hanging from a low branch, and eventually a torn backpack lying in the underbrush. I picked it up, examining it. The fabric was frayed, and it looked like it had been there for years. There was something unsettling about it. I glanced at Ryan, but he just shrugged. "People lose stuff all the time," he said, brushing it off. The sun began to set, the light filtering through the trees turning golden, then orange, and finally fading to a deep blue. It was then we realized just how lost we were. The trail had all but disappeared, and the dense forest around us seemed to close in, every tree looking the same as the last. Both our phones had died, a rookie mistake, not bringing any backup battery, and we were out of water. Panic started to set in as the shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped, and an eerie chill settled over the forest. Suddenly we heard it, a faint sound echoing through the trees. Singing. It was distant, almost melodic, carried on the wind from somewhere further along the trail. My first instinct was relief. Maybe there were other hikers nearby, someone who could help us find our way. But as we listened, the singing didn't sound quite right. It was off-key, warbling, like a broken music box. Ryan looked at me, his face pale in the dim light. "What is that?" he whispered, his bravado finally fading. I didn't have an answer. We pressed on, drawn by the hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd find someone who could help. The singing seemed to come from all directions, echoing strangely through the trees, making it impossible to tell where it originated. That's when we came across a campsite. At first, it looked like salvation, a fire pit, still smoldering with a tent set up beside it. But as we approached, it became clear that something was wrong. The tent flap was open, and inside there were no sleeping bags, no supplies, just a single journal, its pages covered in frantic, incoherent scribbles. "Never leave the trail," one page read, over and over again. The words pressed into the paper with such force that they tore through in places. Ryan tried to laugh it off, but it was shaky. He grabbed the journal, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowing. I could see the unease in his eyes, the same fear that was settling deep in my gut. The singing had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. We needed to leave. Now. We decided to backtrack, to find the stone pile we had left in the clearing, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The trail, if it had ever been real, seemed to shift, the landscape twisting around us. Trees that I swore we had passed before were nowhere to be seen, and new ones seemed to have taken their place. As we pushed through the underbrush, I turned to say something to Ryan, only to realize he wasn't there. Panic gripped me. I called his name, my voice echoing through the empty woods. There was no response. I turned in circles, my heart pounding, trying to catch a glimpse of him through the trees. Then I saw it, his flashlight lying on the ground, the beam flickering weakly. I rushed over, picking it up, my eyes scanning the darkness. There was no sign of him. It was as if he had simply vanished. I stood there alone, the forest pressing in on me, the realization sinking in that I had no idea where I was or how to get out. The trail, if it even existed, had changed, the twists and turns unfamiliar. It felt as though the forest was alive, shifting, toying with me, refusing to let me leave. The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of the trees around me, their branches creaking as if they were whispering secrets to one another. I don't know how long I wandered. Hours, maybe days. Time seemed to blur, the darkness unrelenting, the sun never quite breaking through the thick canopy above. I stumbled, tripped, my body aching, exhaustion pulling at me. The journal was still in my pack, the only proof that any of this had happened. The words, "Never leave the trail," repeating in my mind like a mantra. The singing returned at times, distant and haunting, but I ignored it, too terrified to follow. When I finally emerged from the forest, it was sudden. One moment I was surrounded by trees. The next, I was standing on the edge of a road, miles from where we had started. A passing car slowed, the driver rolling down his window, his face a mix of concern and confusion. He asked if I was okay, but I could barely respond. My voice cracked and dry. I was dehydrated, disoriented, and utterly alone. The authorities didn't believe my story. The trail we had taken wasn't on any map, and no one had ever heard of a hidden lake in that part of the Smokies. They searched for Ryan, but no trace of him was ever found. I tried to explain about the journal, the campsite, the singing, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the forest is still out there, waiting. The journal sits on my shelf, a reminder of what happened, of the friend I lost to a trail that no one else believes existed. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear it, the faint echo of a broken song, drifting through the air, calling me back to the vanishing trail.